Agua de la UNAM, del Instituto de Ingeniería, del Centro Regional de Seguridad Hídrica bajo los auspicios de UNESCO y de Agua Capital, les damos la más cordial bienvenida a nuestra conferencia titulada El agua subterránea es la clave para una tierra sostenible, impartida por el doctor John Cherry, que sin duda es una de las personalidades más importantes en el agua subterránea a nivel global. Muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. Para moderar esta sesión, le voy a dar la palabra al maestro Eduardo Vázquez, director general de Agua Capital. También les agradecemos a todas las personas que nos siguen la transmisión en línea. Eduardo.
Buenos días a todas y todos. Un gusto que nos acompañen. Muy agradecidos, sabemos que las agendas están muy complicadas en estos momentos y por supuesto, qué mejor lugar para podernos reunir, a discutir, a conversar, intercambiar ideas de un tema tan relevante como es el agua subterránea que en la UNAM. Siempre agradecidos de nuestra parte por el sentido de apertura, de colaboración y de sumar esfuerzos para poner los temas clave alrededor de la agenda del agua sobre la mesa. Y en este caso, como bien señalaba Jorge, con la distinguida presencia de John Cherry, una figura, y utilizaría esa palabra con todo sentido, a nivel global en el mundo del agua, que ha marcado una huella significativa en el análisis, el estudio, el impulso de iniciativas alrededor del agua subterránea en distintas partes del mundo. La idea del evento de hoy es justamente compartir una conferencia magistral por parte de John, posteriormente una serie de comentarios que estaremos habilitando aquí a la mesa y un espacio donde podamos intercambiar puntos de vista e ideas con ustedes. La intervención por parte de la UNAM la hará el doctor Antonio González Espriu, que no me detendré en este momento, más adelante daré una semblanza, por supuesto, de su distinguida trayectoria. Y en el caso de John, para cederle la palabra, y nuevamente en este tema tan importante para la Ciudad de México, para México y el mundo en general, justamente ahorita habíamos tenido una conversación sobre la relevancia del tema y de la óptica, del entendimiento pleno de la importancia del agua subterránea. Una breve semblanza de él. John es ingeniero geológico y tiene grados de la Universidad de Saskatchewan en Canadá, la Universidad de California en Berkeley, un doctorado en la Universidad de Illinois, igualmente. Tuvo una participación importante en la Universidad de Waterloo, donde se retiró como un distinguido profesor emérito. Ha recibido múltiples premios y reconocimientos a nivel internacional en Estados Unidos, en el Reino Unido, en Suiza, en Canadá, en Singapur, el premio Lee Kuan Yew de Agua, el premio de la Acción Internacional de Agua de Presidencia y, por supuesto, de manera muy reciente, el premio de Agua de Estocolmo, que se le fue entregado recientemente en el marco de la Semana del Agua, que se celebra año con año en Estocolmo, Suecia. Actualmente es principal investigador en el proyecto G360, en el Instituto del proyecto G360, y es líder del proyecto de agua subterránea, que es una iniciativa que está enfocada a promover la democratización de la información y el acceso a la información en materia de agua subterránea a nivel global. También es actualmente director del consorcio de universidades enfocadas a la investigación en materia de contaminación de agua subterránea. Sin más, John, muchas gracias por estar aquí. Es un honor, un placer y una distinción que podamos contar con tu presencia y tu conocimiento. Te cedería la palabra y posteriormente pasaría a presentar a Antonio para que pueda hacer la moderación del caso. Gracias a todas y todos por estar aquí y buenos días.
Good morning. Thank you for coming to this lecture. It's my great pleasure to be back in Mexico City. I used to come here in the era from 1985 to 1995, where one of my colleagues, Adrian Ortega, was doing a PhD thesis, and we had a project. And I've had an absence since then, and it's a great pleasure to be back to meet those of you that I knew from the past, and also to find out about Mexican water problems, and particularly groundwater problems. So I won those 2 water prizes that was mentioned, and these are water prizes for kind of all people who work in water, and it's very rare that a groundwater scientist wins such a prize. And every once in a while, these organizations decide, I guess, that its time has come for a hydrogeologist to receive a prize. And I always win these prizes because I'm the oldest hydrogeologist still operating. And when I went to Singapore to receive the prize and take part in the festivities back in 2016, I was asked these questions. And I'd spent the past 30 years specializing in the study of groundwater contamination, particularly trichloroethylene. And when I answered the questions, I was very dissatisfied. I feel that I hadn't answered them well. And so what is the state of humanity and the planet from a groundwater perspective? So I'm going to speak very broadly about the fate of humanity and water and all of that from a groundwater perspective. And one could say, well, what is a groundwater scientist doing speaking on such a broad topic? Well, we all specialists live in their little silos and whatnot, so I figured, well, why not? Why not get a view of the world from a groundwater perspective, since groundwater people hadn't been doing that before? But it's taken me about 6 years to get to the point of being able to give this lecture. So humanity depends on these pillars: freshwater, soil, oceans, forests, and climate. And these 5 are all on trajectories towards disaster unless we take collective action to reverse them. And at the bottom I've got climate, and climate refers to both the natural climate change and the anthropogenic or human climate change. And that's where all attention is directed. And I want to direct our attention here today to the other factors. And this talk then covers these 6 issues. Very quickly, I'll just skirt over the surface. And I've got a paper, a manuscript. It's about 14 pages that basically summarize everything in this talk, and it'll be made available here shortly. It's meant for global reading, so I get feedback on all of this. So this is a very important graph. Exponential growth began back, in 1960, and that was my formative years. That's when I was in engineering school. And the big worry about that time, by all the big intellectual thinkers, that we were going to overpopulate the earth and end up in disaster. And there are many books on this topic, and these predictions then didn't happen. They didn't happen then, but they're happening now. So there's a big delay for a variety of reasons. And we've got 2 major problems, and these are very different problems. The one is that we're pumping too much groundwater, we're mismanaging and abusing it, and we need less pumping from many aquifers. Okay, that's one problem. The other problem is groundwater is being underpumped or under-extracted, insufficient to solve global water poverty. For those people, we need more wells, and basically more than 1 billion people are in this category. And they only have one hope for getting out of water poverty, and that hope is groundwater. Because where they live in the rural areas, there's no other water available. And besides, it's all disappearing anyway with drought. So groundwater is solution to the bottom billion, and the bottom billion, maybe 2 billion people. And these are both groundwater problems, but they require very different solutions. So the most essential thing for humans then, we need enough drinking water, not much, enough food, etc., and we need an atmospheric mean temperature, less than about 4 degrees. But we're a long way from that. So even if all the predictions unfold, it's going to be many, many decades before we get to, shall we say, temperature being a crisis. In the meantime, if we don't correct these other problems, we're not going to be worrying about fine groundwater. It's basically everywhere. And everywhere you have a water table, and everywhere below the water table you have fresh water. So it's not that there's not fresh water everywhere that in most cases can be made use of. Now, this is a really key number, that first number, and I didn't carry this number around in my head until I started giving this talk. So 99% of all liquid fresh water is groundwater. Okay, most surface water has groundwater origins, and groundwater is depleted in many areas, and groundwater is the key to fresh water and food. So we live in a world where the only water that people see is basically rivers and lakes and wetlands and whatnot, and that's a small percentage of all the water on the face of the earth, and almost all that water is derived from groundwater anyway. Now, depletion and mismanagement. Excessive groundwater extraction is accompanied by soil salinization, land subsidence, and seawater intrusion. So when we talk about our mismanagement of groundwater, we have to keep in mind that it refers to the land surface and it refers to soil and many other things. So when we put a well on the ground and we pump it modestly, we have a drawdown cone, so we're dewatering. So in a way, we're extracting water from the system. But if we do it responsibly, we don't take too much water away from the rivers, and we don't dry up the aquifers. So there's nothing wrong with using groundwater. Groundwater is a vast resource, and it can serve humanity very well. And it can even serve the 8 billion people we have now and the 10 billion people we're soon to have well if we understood it better and actually managed it better. Oops. Oh, yeah. So, but if we pump it extremely, too long and too hard, then we dewater the aquifer and we draw water in from streams and rivers. Now, there's nothing wrong, and if we're going to develop groundwater responsibly and make it useful, then we have to take water from rivers and lakes. Okay, that's the way the hydrologic system works. But to run it responsibly and sustainably, then we have to make sure that we don't pump so much water that we dry up the rivers and lakes and wetlands, etc. So it's a delicate balance, and it's a complicated one, and it needs to use knowledge and governance. So there are people that map and aquifers, accumulate all the information, and they tell us that there's 68 large aquifers in the world that they classify as large. And I think the Mexico City regional aquifer is one of them. But 1/3 of these are depleted beyond recovery in human time. Okay, that means they've been drained to the point where if you stop pumping now, it would be centuries before they replenish. Now, many of these aquifers are still providing water, so the crisis isn't yet truly upon us. But for these aquifers, they're drained, and they won't be providing all that much water much longer. And here's a recent book by an American professor, the Ogallala Aquifer in the United States, one of the great aquifers in the world. The imminent depletion of the Ogallala and the other aquifers around the world is a defining planetary crisis of our times. So I'm not just giving you my personal view here. People who look into this draw the same conclusion. And this is a huge aquifer in the United States. You can see that it covers several states. It's the breadbaskets of the U.S. for various grains. And you can see then on the right in that photograph, that's irrigation. So why are we in a groundwater crisis across the globe? It's because of irrigation. It's because of agriculture. It's because of the food we choose to eat. And all of these aquifers that are being drained then, they won't be able to produce this amount of food in the future. So regardless of all the other problems in the world, the wars and all of that, the ability of agriculture to produce food the way we're doing it is coming to an end. Doesn't mean we're going to have a disaster. It just means we need to do things differently. It'll be a disaster if we don't. And in California, where, we Canadians seem to live off of food from California. We go into the grocery store and it's all there. It's either there from California or it's there from Mexico. Okay, and it's being dried up too, because if you don't have enough rainfall and if you pump too hard, then you just dry the system up. And if we talk about disasters, let's look at India. India has 1.4 billion people. It's now tied with China. But China's population has leveled off. India's population is going to go up by another 300 million. India is 1/5 of the global people, but on only 4% of the global water. India, world's largest groundwater extracted. 92% of all of the irrigation water is from India. You can imagine. 2/3 of the population depends on agriculture for their living. Tens of millions of farmers live in water security. 6,000 suicides a year. The system's been so mismanaged in terms of wells going dry and debt and all of that. Too many wells, too much pumping, not enough groundwater, bad management. Disaster happening in Iran. Okay, groundwater decline due to extensive overexploitation of groundwater and rising salinity levels points to desire, worsening sovereignty, water security risk across the country. Iran is facing a state of water bankruptcy, and that's from a peer-reviewed article by a very competent team of Iranian water experts. You don't read about that in the news, you read about all the other political stuff. In California, and this slide is now a year old, this reservoir now is almost dry and the boats have all been moved. Okay, and all of the western part of the U.S. now is under drought. And as I mentioned, this should be expected. This isn't anthropogenic climate change. Should be expected, etc. And even in Canada, we haven't had a major drought since the 1930s, and my parents used to tell me about it. Canadians have forgotten about that. Who cares? But basically, we Canadians export a lot of grain to the world. Europe is being hit by a drought crisis, etc. So at this point in time for humanity, we've already pumped out a lot of the groundwater that should be there in reserve to use when you have a drought period. And now we've got droughts coming at us on various continents all at the same time. And, this is a National Geographic article of a few months ago. 80 mighty rivers run dry from overuse. Okay, and most of this overuse then is agriculture. So you pump too much groundwater, you eventually dry up the rivers because groundwater feeds the rivers. And then we've heard about these, okay, the Cape Town drought. And I was in South Africa in Cape Town in 2017. So I was there when the crisis was in full bloom, where they were getting ready to turn off the taps. That only lasted for 2 years. Then we have the Sao Paulo drought. Okay, that was a short one. Then we've got the California drought for a few years. And I would visit all of these places and whatnot when drought was the overriding kind of political issue of the time. But these droughts were very short. Okay, they're not mega droughts. So all of this crisis that we had with these short droughts, that was all a water management crisis. It wasn't a drought crisis. The drought crises are coming. And in this talk, it's rare, but this is the only slide from a paper that I have produced. And it's a complicated slide, but let's just talk about it for a moment. So it's a slide over time from 1500 to 2010, basically of wet and dry climates. Arrived at through groundwater recharge studies and through tree ring studies and through ice core studies. And the point here is that the yellow is when there was a period of drought, and the light blue is when we have a period of normal rainfall. And if you look at the recent drought in California, okay, that was a very small sliver of a drought. And when the yellow bands are large, that's a mega drought. Okay, and a mega drought will last anywhere from 7 to 15 or 20 years. So just imagine a drought coming and it doesn't go away for 10 or 15 years. And just imagine that when your food isn't coming from surface water, because the surface water's all gone away, okay? It's coming from irrigation. The Syrian war, and when you dig deeply into the Syrian war, and I noticed this in some articles, and I actually talked to a student who's doing a PhD thesis on at the University of Newcastle, but if you trace back the reason for social unrest that set off the Syrian war, some people would say it basically came from drought and agriculture and aquifers drying up. Now the climate's always changing, and of course geoscientists always know that. So when you talk about climate change, that's what geology is. So all this business about climate change, it doesn't strike geologists anyway as unusual. In fact, colleagues and I, many years ago, we were afraid of reglaciation. Okay, that's serious for Canada because we'd be totally covered with glaciers. But okay, now we're talking about climate change. So the Arctic had no ice 8,000 years ago. Okay, the glaciers were all gone, etc. And then Europe had the little ice age for more than 100 years when half the population ended up disappearing. So climate change has always been coming at us, and we just now have a more recent version of it that we have to adjust to. Okay, so when we go across the world, let's look at Saudi Arabia and countries like that. Where do they get their water from? They get it from pumping fossil groundwater. Okay, that's water that's 30,000 years old. Okay, so that's groundwater mining. So that has to come to an end. And there's a large region there across the Middle East where they're depending upon fossil groundwater. The irrigation demand of the agricultural sector already amounts to more than 70% of global water supply with withdrawals. Okay, that's a big number and it's likely larger than that. Groundwater food and facts. 40% of global agriculture is by irrigation. Now that's the number you see in the literature, but the number should be 70% of irrigation water is groundwater because you should include the pumped water and the base flow water. So basically humanity then, we're dependent on irrigation now in our globalized food system, and it's mostly groundwater. Where do you ever read that? Okay, so there's something called virtual water, developed by a British geographer who won the Stockholm Water Prize about 17 years ago. And he basically pointed out that when you look at food, food has water embedded in it, and so in our globalized food system, it's a globalized water exportation system. And that was followed up by Dutch engineers who do a lot of calculations. These are the two famous ones. And basically, water is being shipped around the globe every day on boats and trains and airplanes, etc., in food. So we have an entire globalized food system now, very delicately balanced on supply and demand and water and food being produced, that's unstable. So we have a food insecurity of the highest order. And then I was in a grocery store in a rural area of Canada half a year ago or so, and I was looking at some asparagus that I was about to buy, and I looked at the label, asparagus from Peru. Huh. And why are we getting asparagus from Peru at that time of the year? It's because it doesn't come from anywhere else. It's not coming from Mexico or the U.S. And then I found this article. This article focuses on Peru, where agricultural export production has led to huge economic growth and employment, but at the expense of unsustainable aquifer depletion. So for a short period of time, this gives jobs, it gives companies a bunch of money, but in the end, you end up with no jobs and basically depleting your aquifer and nothing but hardship for the local people. And those of us buying the asparagus have no idea that we're doing harm. And the other day when I looked, I was buying blueberries from Peru. Usually it's from Mexico. Now, irrigated agriculture then destroys soil in a variety of ways, and one of them is irrigation, because basically the sun evaporates the water and the salt is left in the soil. So if we do irrigation, we have to do it very, very carefully, or it's not sustainable. Furthermore, groundwater is the largest cause of relative sea level rise at many coastal cities due to a combination of land subsidence and groundwater depletion. And when you listen to the news media, they tell you that anthropogenic greenhouse gases are going to raise the temperature and are going to melt the glaciers, and they tell us already this is causing sea level to rise, threatening humanity. That's nonsense. The threatening of humanity, of the 400 million people or so, is basically from pumping too much groundwater. Can you imagine? It's because all this pumped groundwater is raising sea level by 25% or so, and it's causing these megacities to subside. So the capital of Indonesia, which is a country of larger population than Mexico, they're having to move the capital because of so much subsidence. That's just groundwater pumping. It's got nothing to do with climate change. Oops, what did I do? I pressed the wrong button. Oops. Okay, so nitrate is the most damaging widespread groundwater pollutant. Nitrate is harmful to human health, much more than acknowledged. Nitrate drinking water limit is basically set too low. So no government in the world has the courage to lower the drinking water limit for nitrate. Otherwise, you're going to have hundreds of millions of people across the world drinking water that's deemed to be unsafe. But that's what's happening. Because with modern agriculture goes too much chemical fertilizer use. And one of my colleagues, Warren Wood, submitted this paper where he does a nitrogen balance very carefully. And what he finds then is that the nitrogens that is seeping out of the ground, going into rivers, lakes, and estuaries and all of that, a very significant part of it now is coming from groundwater. So if we stopped using nitrate excessively, it would take a long time for this to clean up. But we need to do that. So the key point, our globalized economy with increased food choice, but also increased food insecurity because of damaging and unsustainable agriculture, basically based on the irrigation that drains aquifers. Okay, so that's one topic. The other topic is water poverty. And water poverty is defined as those people who live under conditions where they don't have safe drinking water. In other words, they get ill mostly from bacteria, from animal and human waste. And the women and children have to walk to get the water. So there's more than 1 billion people around the globe who live in what we would say is water poverty. Their hardship every day is governed by the water they don't have. And that's a solvable problem that's been there for many, many decades, which we don't solve. We don't solve it because as humanity, we're incompetent, and we don't want to solve it. Okay, and this water will all be contaminated, etc., and they walk to get it. Water washes away poverty. So in all the organizations around the world that have the intention to eradicate poverty, they don't realize in general that water is underlying poverty. And if you don't fix the water problem, you're not going to fix the poverty problem. So where was there water poverty? Well, in America, there was water poverty more than 100 years ago. Like all the settlers came out and they went out onto the landscape and they had nothing and they had to have water to survive. And how did they get it? They got it by hand digging wells and putting in little pumps and whatnot. Okay, they would actually dig for the water, which is what they do in Africa. Okay, and they would put together very simple mechanical systems without engines. And you can dig for water and you can get water without engines, and that's what happened in America more than 100 years ago. Okay, people looked after the problem. They solved it themselves, whichever way they could, because they had no alternative. And so how do we know all this? But the records show the sales of hand pumps. 45 million hand pumps were made between 1600s and 1970. Okay, that gives a number. Okay, we would look upon that today as being ridiculous technology. So we're not trying to bring this technology to countries that need it. The simplest way of making wells is always the best. Water poverty was eradicated from America by self-supply that started locally with low-cost methods used by local people. This is the key to solving rural water poverty. Okay, but we have to have subsidies. But if the people aren't doing it themselves and involved in it and believe in it, then it doesn't work. So we've been a failure as a rich community in the Western world. We've been a failure because we've tried to bring solve the water poverty problem by giving gifts, by giving wells. Now, many of these rural water poverty people live in mountains, okay, and more than 1.1 billion people live in mountainous regions, and many of them in Asia and quite a few in Mexico, for example. And many are in water poverty because they're not where big drill rigs can come and they're not where you can build sewers and water lines. So what have we done as a community? We've just forgotten about it. There's been no major effort to solve this problem. And these aren't my slides. I have slides up in the mountains, but they're never this good. So I show these because they're kind of beautiful. So what are people doing up in the mountains? They're basically doing agriculture, which they use to survive. In many cases, it's subsistence agriculture because they use it to survive. And in some cases, it actually is brought down to the villages below. And many mountains, in my opinion, not that we know for sure, this is a speculation, look like this. You have a water table, and mountains are made of rock, so you've got fractures in the rock, and that's where the water is. And people live, in general, as high as the mountains as they can have water from springs and seeps. And we have a water table. So the hydrology of springs and seeps is poorly studied, and the hydrology of mountains with springs and seeps is almost not studied, even though there's more than 1 billion people that need that type of knowledge. And I did a trip in China back in 2006 with a colleague to look at the water problems in the mountains there. These are people in rural water poverty. And they're all up there doing agriculture, etc., living a life. It's just that they have rather extreme illness due to bacterial contamination. And so what governments do in this day and age, in China and elsewhere, they make the springs and seeps look better. Okay, these are called improved water supplies. So the UN, for example, with great fanfare about 15 years ago, announced that they'd cut the number of people, 10 years ago, cut the number that we in society had reduced the number of people living in water poverty from 2 billion to 800,000, 200 to 800 million. And that was nonsense because they hadn't tested the improved water supplies to see if they were safe. They just looked better. Can you imagine? And then an NGO came along and decided to go and do a whole bunch of testing and found out that these claims were nonsensical. All they'd done was make the water more convenient to get and the water sources look good. And in China, where they pretty well eradicated poverty, they still have this problem because it's a difficult one to solve. In Canada, we have it big time in the communities where our indigenous people live. We haven't been able to solve it. We just throw money at it. Okay, and bacteria is the issue, etc. Now, if this is a graph, so we look at the urban population, it's going way up, and we look at the rural population. So the rural population is starting to go down, but that's 3 billion people. Okay, and we're not going to solve the problem of rural poverty with bringing them into the cities. In many countries, their life in the cities is much, much worse than it is where they were living before. So the largest and most shameful failure of our society, more than 2 billion people have had no access to safe drinking water in 1995, and this number has increased with population growth, and it is now 1/3 of humanity, some people estimate, is in water poverty. Why have I used 1995? Because that's the first year that they started to tabulate these things. In 2010, the United Nations passed a resolution saying that basically all human beings have a human right to safe drinking water. Okay? So the number of humans without this human right is in fact going up, not down. Now we've got concepts here. We've got peak water. We are at peak global fresh water. We've got peak sustainable water. We passed that long ago. And we've got peak ecological water. We probably passed that long ago, but we don't really know what it means, and it's not being tabulated, and it's kind of a nebulous concept. Peak water, okay. So I went looking for graphs and a paper on this, and here's the global water withdrawals graph. And there's the US graph. So basically it seems now that that graph is leveling off, and so we've reached peak global water withdrawals. And is that because people don't want more water? Yeah, they want more water. We want to pump more water, we want more water, etc. It's just there's no more water to pump. If the rivers go dry, you can't get more. If the aquifers go dry. So I think we basically have reached peak water. We've certainly long ago passed peak sustainable water. Now this graph on the left is really critical. It's published by very distinguished people at the International Association of Hydrogeologists in a bulletin in 2015. And it shows the depletion volume in kilometers cubed versus time. And look at it. It's just going straight up. There's an air band on there, and there's huge uncertainty. So when we're wondering how much groundwater is being pumped from our aquifers globally, we don't really know. But the people who know a little bit say that it's a huge number and it's rising markedly. So we passed peak water. Okay, we passed peak sustainable water because much of the water we're using now is unsustainable. So obviously, if you believe in these graphs, then you have to believe that we're really in the midst of a global water crisis and it revolves around groundwater. Now, running out of water. So these numbers then, we have the renewable freshwater resources, meter cubed per capita. Look at them. They're all going down. And global average, etc. And we're about to add 2 billion people. Wow. Let's look at this. Land used by agriculture. It's going down. Total land area is going down. Okay, and that's because there's no more land to make. We can cut the Brazilian rainforest and we can make a bit of land that'll last for a bit of time, but while we're doing that, we're losing a lot of other land. Okay, not only is the area of productive soil declining, but the nutrition level of the food is also declining. Okay, that's important. Soil degradation is a reason for inadequate human nutrition. And the guy who wrote this paper is the dean of that type of research, Latan Lau at Ohio State. He's published for years on this. Okay, he's an advocate of alternative agriculture that gives you nutritious food. Okay, so we're on a disastrous treachery for humanity. 4 billion people live in areas of severe physical water scarcity for at least 1 month per year. This is now up to 2 months per year. And it's headed for 3 months per year. And then, we see reports, UNESCO, projected groundwater use increased by 30%. Well, no, that's nonsense. There's no more water to use at that level, okay? The increase is impossible, not enough water. So there are lots of projections of how we need more water to get through the next 50 years while we add 2 billion people, but almost no interest in the community that's supposed to be responsible looking at this in what's feasible or not. So key point, okay, we've got freshwater, soil, oceans, forests, and climate, and all factors needed for human survival have greatly deteriorated, and this deterioration continues. Now, Societies collapse, okay? Civilizations collapse. They've all collapsed in the past, more or less. And you people in Mexico know more than enough about that. And there was an important book published by a global expert on this back in 2005. Factors that precipitate societal collapse and environmental damage like deforestation, pollution, soil depletion, erosion, climate change, etc., and conflict. So as we have these declining trajectories, on the trajectories we're on, it has to lead to collapse, which is my conclusion of my 6-year journey to try and find out what's going on. So as a society, we are choosing to fail by erroneous and irresponsible public policies. We allow and even subsidize just about everything that is harmful. We have 592 known transboundary aquifers. Okay, these are aquifers that go from one country to another. And only 4 of them have legal documents signed as to how the water is going to be used. Lots of room for conflict in the future. Dire projections. These aren't my projections. Nearly 6 billion people will suffer from clean water scarcity by 2050. This number may be an underestimation, and it comes from a very reliable report, source, the World Water Development Report, etc. So where do you read these numbers? All you read about is anthropogenic greenhouse gases and how we need to basically stop burning coal, which we probably should do. We certainly should do. But in terms of what's going to do us all in, it's not going to be that. So here's my diagram for catastrophe. Up on the left, we have erosion, salinization, and nutrient decline. On the right, we have aquifer depletion, subsidence, and sea level rise. And then we've got drought. And then we've got farmer and food insecurity. And then we've got social instability. We've got water poverty, and drought triggers migrations of people. And the end result of all this is migration, refugees, and armed conflict, if you take it down the road and project these graphs where they're going. So a conclusion. A collapse of our civilization is underway. Those living in affluence will shrink while the rest of humanity expands until the remaining affluent are in enclaves surrounded by the vast majority in extreme poverty, famine, ravaged landscapes, migrations, and social conflict, unless we make some drastic changes. And the amazing part of this is that this is much more solvable than, shall we say, climate change. Our chances of doing much on climate change are not very large because it's going to take global governance. And besides, the climate change may not be totally or strongly controlled by greenhouse gases. It might be controlled by other things because we've had droughts, hundreds of years ago. So we must not invest all of our apples in, shall we say, trying to stop burning coal or whatever. We got to deal with these other things. The early fear of a global food crisis resulted in the Green Revolution. Okay, and better seeds were good, like better genetics, chemical fertilizer, pesticides, and monocrops. Okay, what has this led to? And irrigation. Irrigation by depleting aquifers has enabled the so-called Green Revolution to appear sustainable. Groundwater is unseen and the wells are unseen and mostly unmonitored. So this great claim by the big ag industry that they solved the humanity's food crisis is nonsense. Irrigation solved it. And in addition, then, all these applications of fertilizers and pesticides, all that is degrading the soil. The Green Revolution was absolutely the dirty agricultural revolution. As a sustainable solution for global food, this revolution was a mirage, okay? Just a mirage that people seem to still think is going to be our savior. Agriculture is a major contributor to greenhouse gases. Roughly a quarter of all the man-made greenhouse gases are from agriculture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if we want to basically save society from this collapse, while we do it and we fix the soil and we fix some other things and we stop cutting the forests, we're also combating climate change. Okay, that makes sense. So let's get back to this graph then. So we have a peak coming at us. And the good news is that like 10 or 15 years ago, we didn't know what was going to happen with the world population. All we could see was it would be ever increasing. If that would be the scenario, then for sure we're doomed. The good news of this graph is we're actually leveling off. China's leveled off, etc. So all we have to do is get through the next few decades, and then we'll have peak population. And if we do that, then that's our accomplishment. Fixing agriculture is the key. We need to change agriculture by changing the food we choose to eat. And in the rich countries, that's not so. In the rich countries, we need to make major changes because we're the major consumers of the foods that are doing harm. the beef and all of that. In the developing countries, there's no reason, I think, to disrupt your economies for this. Oh, and there's lots of alternative agriculture if you go reading. There's great hope with alternative agriculture, as a matter of fact. It's a surprising industry, many different types. So subsidies of the types of agriculture that are destroying the planet in Europe. Isn't this an astounding number? This number in the United States basically is what's governing global agriculture. Governments in these countries are basically subsidizing the end of humanity. We don't do much subsidies in Canada, as a matter of fact. These subsidies have, of course, done major harm to agriculture in Mexico, as I understand it, and major harm to agriculture in Africa and other places, because of this hugely subsidized food coming from rich countries that totally disrupts the economies of these other countries. This is the book to read if you want to have hope for agriculture and to see that there are alternatives. This is a guy with a soil science degree who's an award-winning filmmaker, etc. And this is his conclusion in 2015. To feed the world with its ballooning population without destroying the planet's land and water is likely the greatest challenge that humanity has faced. So these aren't my opinions I'm giving you here. These are opinions that I patched together from all these other sources. 1/3 of humanity is in water poverty and increasing, and unfortunately, the organizations who have the responsibility, presumably, for making progress on these problems, the United Nations, the World Bank, the Gates Foundations, and all the other organizations with the financial resources to solve this problem are accomplishing nothing, mostly negative effects. There's urgency to define the problem better and to make a specific plan with milestones and to do it. And so for these billion people who need just safe drinking water, there's 3 ways to get it. One, you can have these simple little filters. The other is you can do rainwater harvesting. And in many places like India and parts of Mexico, where there's lots of rainfall for a short period of time, there's lots of water. It just runs off. So that water has to be captured, like in the monsoons in India. So rainwater harvesting is a big deal, and then we need to drill tens of millions of wells, but we need to do it as low cost as possible. And as I mentioned, groundwater is everywhere, so is this feasible? So in 2005, I was on a trip out in the Gobi Desert in China to look at a proposed site for a nuclear waste repository, and we're driving along, and then I see this, something that looked like a well. So we jumped out of our vehicles, and it was a well. You look down, it's 6 meters down, fresh water. What's that well doing there? Well, the nomads, who've been traveling across this desert for centuries on camels, etc., had built wells, like oases. Okay, and it's fresh water, 2 meters down. The nuclear agency was very depressed over this because they want to put a repository there, and the last thing they want is a bunch of fresh water at shallow depth. Okay, and so how do you drill water wells at a really low cost manually without a bunch of money? And there are a variety of ways of doing it. On the left, there's a machine there developed at the University of Utah, which is not a low-cost machine, but it's low cost to operate, so it's being used to produce thousands of wells. Very clever. And then you have on the right a machine invented in Bolivia by a German engineer who was down there trying to get water for water-poor people. It's a marvelous machine, high-level engineering thinking, but all the parts are low cost. So advanced technology shouldn't mean advanced technologies as we know it. It should be advanced thinking. In the U.S., how did these poor people get water? They use machines like that. There's one on the left, with horses, etc. And on the right, we have the machine I mentioned developed in Bolivia. And then we have small machines being invented but not used very much. This one developed by a Rotary Club, and this is a small mechanical machine, a cable tool drill, specifically invented for using in areas where you don't have much money, and where you've got a simple machine you can train local people on. So these technologies are out there. It's just they're hardly ever used. They're not recognized by the organizations that should recognize them, and there's very little progress. And here are rock drilling machines that I'm enamored with at the moment. One is a handheld portable drill. The other one is also portable, and the other one on the right is built in Vancouver, and it's portable too. You just take it apart and whatnot. So these machines can be taken up into the mountains. These machines can be drilled to drill wells in mountains at relatively low cost where there's no other choice. If you don't use machines like this, these people are not going to have water. And if we take Africa, it has the same problems. I mean, Africa has huge, huge water problems, and that's where much of the famine is going to occur. There's lots of groundwater there, lots of shallow groundwater there. It just isn't accessed. And if you take this type of geology shown here is in many, many places, but you'd have to understand it. You'd have to have a plan. You'd have to have some maps so the local people could take their machines and whatnot and get water, etc. Okay, so what's the cause of all of this mess? It's not that we human beings want to collapse. It's not that we're bad people. It's not that the rich countries want the worst outcomes for the poor countries. It's this. So the commercial science publishing industry, profit above all. So almost all the science that's produced now is published in for-profit journals, published in ways that nobody can understand it except the authors who wrote it. It's useless knowledge because it's not accessible. With academia, too much analysis and not much synthesis. We got all these poor professors working away to write papers on their little niches, okay? The world doesn't need their little papers directly. The world needs that research and understanding, but it needs the knowledge to be broadened, to be explained, to be made useful. We've got the economists. Well, they're the cause of it all. When the anthropologists of the future write, how did humanity demise, surely the economists will be the leaders, where nothing matters but market forces and all of that. And then we've got the global bureaucracies, the G20, the WHO, the World Bank, etc. When it comes to these problems, the bottom billion, they're totally ineffective. In fact, they're in the way. And then we've got governance, okay? The subsidies are all for what is harmful. But what's the key impediment to progress? Knowledge from research and experience is not being converted into understandable and actionable information suitable for societal problem solving. All right, we need synthesis. And synthesis is where you take the knowledge produced by all the researchers and the people who have learned stuff from experience, and you formulate it and explain it so that others can make use of it. I mean, that's supposed to be the purpose of research. Okay, and this is a quote from the web. It's a very good one. It basically indicates that if we synthesize our knowledge, we'll be basically doing a lot of good. So after the Singapore Water Prize event, and I realized that I didn't know much, and I was asked important questions as to what's groundwater about and whatnot, I, along with colleagues, developed this project, the Groundwater Project. And we believe that knowledge should be free in many languages. And so we have a project with minimal funding where people from all over the world write books attempting to make their knowledge and the other knowledge accessible. So you can go on the web and you can see the books that we're publishing, and we hope then, we've got 200 books in progress, so we would hope here down the road that knowledge won't be the impediment. Figuring out how to put it into practice is still an impediment. And then a very important part of this project is translations. So our goal then, the papers are all published in English first, and we need to change that, and then they're translated. In the future, we hope that the original documents will be written in whatever language, such as Spanish, and then we'll translate from there. So the whole idea here is globalization of knowledge, free for all. Now, final point. Policymakers claim that the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are the key factor for human survival, to which all intervention efforts must be directed. So if we don't get off of that and start investing as a society in these other pillars, then we're doomed. And this policy will be the last big mistake our civilization will make as we pass the point of no return. So I guess that's the conclusion of my 6-year voyage to try and figure out, is groundwater important? And this was an amazing voyage, and it's amazing to me to find out the result. Like, is groundwater important? Wow, it's all important. And so I'm really pleased to be here in Mexico for this short trip, but I hope to make other trips. Because what I should have known and what I'm learning in my few days here is that Mexico is a microcosm of almost all the problems that we have. Interesting. Canada isn't a microcosm. I just happen to be from Canada. Most of what I'm talking about here is irrelevant in Canada. We've got too much water and we're happy to pollute it and waste it, so it doesn't matter to us. And we're a rich country. So all that doesn't matter. But as a Canadian then, I'm very anxious to make my knowledge useful on the global stage and to get all sorts of advice. So this talk is an experiment. It's an experiment in making up a conceptual model and seeing if it flies. So thanks for your attention.
Muchísimas gracias, John, por tan interesante exposición y especialmente por hacer planteamientos que no solo hacen pasar a la reflexión, sino también que cuestionan en cierta medida el modelo tradicional de gestión de agua, de toma de decisiones y de modelos de gobernanza alrededor de gestión del recurso hídrico. Estoy seguro que hay muchas preguntas en la audiencia, pero primero que nada quisiera hacerle la palabra al doctor Antonio Hernández Espriu para hacer los comentarios del caso alrededor de esta interesante exposición. Brevemente, el doctor Hernández Espriu es ingeniero geólogo, egresado de la Facultad de Ingeniería de la UNAM, es posgraduado del curso internacional de hidrología subterránea de la Universidad Politécnica de Cataluña y es doctor graduado con la distinción summa cum laude por la Universidad Complutense de Madrid en el área de hidrogeología ambiental. Ha tenido y tiene una actividad importante en ámbitos de consultoría, por supuesto en el ámbito académico, donde ha fungido como jefe del Departamento de Ingeniería Geológica y como jefe de la División de Ciencias de la Tierra de la Facultad de Ingeniería de este instituto. Actualmente imparte asignaturas relacionadas con aguas subterráneas y geología ambiental a nivel licenciatura y posgrado. Es profesor titular B de tiempo completo, coordinador académico del Grupo de Hidrogeología y de Especialización en Agua Subterránea de la Facultad de Ingeniería del UNAM, miembro del Sistema Nacional de Investigadores, sustenta varios premios y fue investigador visitante del Bureau de Economic Geology de la Universidad de Texas en Austin. Ha publicado múltiples artículos científicos y sus líneas de investigación abordan estos temas. Sin más, gracias, doctor Hernández Espriu. Te cedo la palabra.
Muchas gracias a todas y a todos. Pues le agradecemos al doctor John Cherry por esta extraordinaria charla que nos abre un poco la visión sobre pensar fuera de la caja, ¿no? Y pensar como desde el punto de vista más académico, pues que tenemos que llevar a cabo acciones más concretas, que la ciencia es muy bonita, es muy elegante, pero que tal vez no estamos llegando a la sociedad, a los políticos, a los tomadores de decisión para resolver problemas reales. Así que, bueno, en particular le agradecemos muchísimo al doctor John Cherry, es una personalidad mundial en el ámbito de una autoridad científica en el ámbito del agua subterránea, así que muchísimas gracias, John, por esta interesantísima charla. Voy a tratar de hacer un resumen junto con algunos comentarios personales con relación al keynote que nos dio el doctor John Cherry. Inició el doctor John Cherry diciéndonos, digamos, que en un premio que le dieron en 2016, le preguntaron pues qué tan importante era el agua subterránea a nivel mundial y qué tanta influencia ha tenido el agua subterránea para la humanidad en general. Y esto pues en general lo conflictuó. Él, como experto en agua subterránea, pues contestó, pero a lo largo de más de 6 años ha tratado de responder esta pregunta: ¿qué tan importante es el agua subterránea a nivel mundial? ¿Qué tanta influencia tiene el agua subterránea en la pobreza, en los conflictos sociales, etcétera? Y pues derivado de esto ha desarrollado durante muchos años el concepto de agua subterránea y sustentabilidad. Para ello nos planteó el doctor John Cherry una serie de pilares en los que se sustenta la humanidad, que es el agua dulce, los suelos, los bosques, el clima y los océanos, y señaló que ya prácticamente toda el agua dulce es agua subterránea. El 99% del agua dulce disponible o utilizable para nuestros fines de desarrollo sociales, económicos, pues es agua subterránea. Mencionó que ha habido un cambio exponencial de la población desde 1960 hasta la fecha, y se considera que la población, que hoy en día ya somos 10,000 millones de personas, tendrá un pico aproximadamente en 2060 o en 2070. Y esto generará una sobreextracción de los sistemas hidrogeológicos de manera insostenible que tenemos que resolver en el corto, en el largo y en el mediano plazo. Acerca del mal manejo que se ha tenido en general sobre el agua subterránea, nos señaló el doctor Cherry que pues básicamente el agua subterránea sigue siendo un aspecto desconocido para los políticos, un aspecto desconocido para la sociedad, que hemos tenido poca influencia en el ámbito práctico del desarrollo social. Y el mal manejo de los recursos hídricos subterráneos ha generado en general subsidencia del terreno, ha generado mucha salinización de suelos, ha generado intrusión marina en zonas costeras y ha generado una disminución del caudal base en ríos y arroyos, secando también parte del agua superficial. Ya de manera genérica se tiene un consenso o una cuantificación gruesa de los recursos hídricos subterráneos a nivel mundial, aunque todavía hay mucho por hacer en el ámbito de la cuantificación a nivel local. Menciona que existen actualmente 68 sistemas regionales de agua subterránea a nivel mundial, de los que se toma el 40% del agua subterránea, y esto ha generado, dos retos muy importantes. Cumplir con la enorme demanda de la agricultura y con la gigantesca producción de comida que tenemos a nivel mundial. Y estos son los dos problemas básicos a los que nos vamos a enfrentar si no queremos colapsar como sociedad. ¿Cómo le vamos a hacer para cumplir con esta demanda agrícola que toma el 70 o el 75% del consumo mundial de agua, y cómo cumplir con esta producción de comida que es cada vez más retadora porque somos muchos millones de personas en el mundo? Citó varios ejemplos que están a punto de colapsar a nivel de sociedad, como por ejemplo en la India, en donde la India ya tiene 1.400 millones de personas. La India es el país por mucho que más extrae agua subterránea a nivel mundial, pero de estos 1.400, es decir, la India tiene ya un quinto de la población mundial, pero solo un 4% del agua disponible. Y esto ha generado muchísimos problemas sociales que se van a agudizar en un futuro. También hay otros países en África, por ejemplo Irak, que está enfrentando ya una bancarrota de agua a nivel país, y esto genera muchísimos problemas. Toda esta sobreextracción y el mal manejo se ha traslapado con problemas relacionados con sequías. Se han enfrentado sequías extraordinarias cortas y sequías y mega sequías que duran más de 7, 8, 10, 15 años, que generan una disminución enorme en la recarga. En el norte de Estados Unidos, en el oeste de Estados Unidos, en Brasil, en Europa, incluso Canadá también ha sido testigo de estas sequías. Pero el doctor Cherry nos establece que estas sequías son en general parte del ciclo hidrológico, y que a lo largo de una ventana de tiempo de 50 o 100 años los acuíferos son propensos a cambios de recarga y a cambios de sequía, y que realmente estos problemas de agua no se deben tanto al problema en sí de la sequía, sino a que no hemos podido gestionar las aguas subterráneas en conjunto con las aguas subterráneas de una manera holística, ¿no? De una manera integral que nos haya permitido resolver el problema de fondo. Hizo alguna mención también de que en las zonas costeras hay actualmente documentado una relación de la sobreextracción de los acuíferos. Eso genera un hundimiento del terreno, subsidencia, y eso además de promover una intrusión del agua de mar, ha generado también riesgos de aumento de inundaciones. Pero son temas que no tienen que ver con el cambio climático, sino que tienen que ver con errores humanos, otra vez donde los gestores, donde los políticos y donde los tomadores de decisión no tienen información hidrogeológica palpable a la mano y no conocen en general los sistemas hidrogeológicos, porque poco se ha hecho por monitorear las aguas subterráneas y por abrir el conocimiento. Entonces, estableció como key point o como punto central en la charla que este aumento de las actividades agrícolas y de la producción de la comida ha generado genera o supone uno de los retos más importantes que vamos a enfrentar como sociedad en los próximos años, si no queremos que las sociedades colapsen en general. El segundo key point que estableció el doctor Cherry fue la pobreza en torno al agua, o el water poverty, la pobreza de agua, que es una pobreza relacionada con la falta de agua, tanto en términos de calidad como en términos de cantidad. Y para ello hay una serie de soluciones que se pueden establecer en el corto, mediano y largo plazo, que fue desarrollando a lo largo de su charla, soluciones basadas en tecnologías costo-efectivas, que iré mencionando más adelante. Hoy en día estableció un dato muy fuerte, que ya del orden de 4.000 millones de personas viven en zonas de escasez de agua o zonas inmersas en una situación de estrés hídrico muy fuerte, y el incremento de la extracción pues ya es prácticamente imposible. Ya no podemos extraer más agua subterránea para mejorar el abastecimiento en estas zonas, lo que va a generar conflictos sociales, muy particularmente en entornos transfronterizos. Hay una serie de acuíferos transfronterizos a nivel mundial, donde el reto es aún mayor, porque los acuíferos que comparten 2 o 3 o 4 países tienen legislaciones hídricas diferentes, tienen políticas diversas, y si gestionar un solo sistema acuífero en un país es difícil, pues ahora gestionar los acuíferos transfronterizos es todavía más complejo. Entonces, pues se estableció como conclusión principal que si no establecemos cambios drásticos en el corto plazo, vamos a estar en un problema muy fuerte a nivel mundial, un problema que no está siendo abordado ni por Naciones Unidas, ni por el Banco Mundial, ni por fundaciones como la Fundación Gates, que se han burocratizado, que han generado otro tipo de problemas, y por lo tanto pues estableció el doctor Cherry que hay que llevar a cabo un cambio drástico en las actividades agrícolas, hay que llevar a cabo cultivos mixtos, hay que migrar hacia cultivos orgánicos, hay que migrar hacia una producción local hidropónica, incluso hay que cambiar la dieta, de los balances de dieta de las personas. Y con respecto a las captaciones, al monitoreo de las aguas subterráneas y a la captación de la extracción de agua subterránea en el subsuelo, pues es necesario llevar a cabo soluciones locales, soluciones que sean costo-efectivas, y no pensar que el desarrollo tecnológico per se nos va a ayudar, sino que más bien hay que utilizar la tecnología para diseñar soluciones de bajo costo, soluciones que sean aplicables, por ejemplo, en zonas montañosas. Habló mucho, y lo hablábamos antes de la charla, del concepto de mountain hydrology, ¿no? De la hidrogeología de montañas, que es algo que muy poco se sabe, y muchas pequeñas localidades o muchas pequeñas poblaciones se abastecen de la captación de pequeños manantiales, a partir de medios fracturados, donde tal vez el nivel estático está más profundo, pero a través de conductos, de discontinuidades, el agua aflora en la superficie a través de pequeños manantiales que pueden ser captados, y esta situación de la hidrogeología de montañas podría resolver parcialmente, a nivel local al menos, los consumos de agua y los desarrollos agrícolas. Entonces nos habló de incentivar actividades en torno a la cosecha de agua, nos habló de muchos ejemplos que ha visto sobre el diseño de tecnologías para perforar pozos manuales, que no sean tan caros, que ya no pensemos en los equipos de perforaciones enormes, costosos, sino que pensemos en equipos pequeños, sencillos, incluso equipos portátiles para poder captar el agua subterránea. Y bueno, fue muy duro en establecer que una de las principales causas, sino que la principal causa de todo este problema, pues, es la ignorancia a nivel de gobierno, la ignorancia a través de fundaciones, y platicó mucho sobre un concepto que me parece muy interesante, que es pues, en la academia qué estamos haciendo, ¿no? Estamos un poco atrapados en este conocimiento que se ha privatizado. Los que hacemos investigación nos dedicamos a publicar artículos que no se entienden, publicar artículos que son pensados para nuestros pares, pero no para la población, y que son publicados en entidades privadas, donde la información no se abre al público en general. Entonces, pues en la academia se lleva a cabo mucho análisis y mucha ciencia, pero poca aplicabilidad, poca aplicación para la resolución práctica de la sociedad y de la humanidad, y la ciencia en general no se convierte en soluciones reales para la sociedad, ¿no? Creo que es una tarea por lo menos que nos llevamos los que trabajamos en la academia. Y derivado de lo anterior, el doctor Cherry tuvo como principal motivación encargarse de un proyecto que es el proyecto de agua subterránea, el Groundwater Project, que es un portal donde se incorpora información abierta particularmente a partir del financiamiento de muchas entidades de Canadá y muchas entidades internacionales. Ha financiado un proyecto en el cual ya se han editado hasta el momento 27 libros de agua subterránea que son totalmente gratuitos, están digitalizados y están abiertos en el portal, y hay muchos libros más de agua subterránea que se van a ir incorporando a este portal, en lo que él le llama la democratización del conocimiento, ¿no? que es importante tener conocimiento disponible, abierto y gratuito para la sociedad, para los políticos, para los tomadores de decisión, para las próximas generaciones en torno al agua subterránea. Bueno, pues creo que básicamente fue lo más importante que nos estableció el doctor Cherry. Les agradezco y le vuelvo a agradecer a John su magnífica conferencia. Muchas gracias, John.
Muchísimas gracias al doctor Antonio Hernández Espriu por los comentarios tan puntuales. Por supuesto, abrimos el espacio a preguntas y respuestas, que seguramente las hay. Yo les agradecería si para beneficio de John se pudieran presentar a aquellos que quieran participar, para que él pudiera identificar y poder establecer un diálogo con todas y con todos. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias. Mi nombre es Edgar Álvarez, soy abogado, estoy muy impresionado por la información que se dio y quisiera brevemente decir lo siguiente. Tocó un aspecto importante de la organización que en el mundo no se está dando y que está privatizada. Efectivamente, el capitalismo o el neoliberalismo es lo que ha provocado y ha profundizado esas contradicciones. La pregunta muy concreta: ¿tenemos que socializar las decisiones, la participación, ya? ¿O tenemos que esperar más tiempo? Esa es una primera pregunta. Y la segunda, si efectivamente la gran extracción del agua subterránea por las grandes transnacionales está provocando una crisis también incluso ambiental, y la invitación es tener una producción autosustentable, ¿tiene que ser socializada o tiene que seguir siendo privatizada? Gracias por sus respuestas.
Well, thank you for those two questions. First of all, when I comment that the journals as a profit-making effort are basically corrupt, I'm not criticizing the competence of the companies doing it. The companies that have taken this over did as they should for their shareholders. They maximize profit. The mistake has been with academia and government allowing the journals to own the intellectual property. And the mistake is with academia to allow the journal system to basically take control of judgments of value and merit. So the mistake is, I think, so if I were running things, I would keep the journals more or less as they're doing, all of that, because that's how science progresses. But I wouldn't have the journals owning the intellectual property, because then you don't have synthesis, then you don't have translations, then you don't have a free-flowing world to make use of the knowledge. So the mistake was not a mistake of the corporations. It was a mistake of government policy and the academic institutions. And then the poor professors are caught up in this basically corrupt system. So it's a matter, I think, it's a matter of how profit-making industry gets to participate. So I would still have them participate, but they would be hired for their management skills. It wouldn't be a rip-off. Now, your second question is the bigger picture of, I think, public ownership versus private ownership. And in some parts of the world, in some cities and countries, the whole water system has been privatized. And the reason for that, the excuse for that, is that what was happening in the past was inefficient, too expensive, and largely incompetent. So the challenge is, how do we make water efficient, run by organizations that are competent? And that may very well be a mixture of private and public ownership, but water, like intellectual ideas, should not be owned. So different governments and different organizations are going to solve the problems differently. And the experts who have reviewed this find that some of the privatized water systems actually worked better. And they found that many of them didn't. So in fact, in that case, the privatization wasn't of a benefit to society at large. So I think the issue is, now if we take Canada, for example, we have, 5% of our population is indigenous people, and they're mostly in poverty. And many of them live in remote areas, on the so-called reserves. Many of them are in water poverty. The Canadian government is throwing billions of dollars at that. It's not we Canadians don't want to solve the problem. It's just that our bureaucracies are incompetent. There's no competence in our capital city. The indigenous people now have some powers. So they actually get to run the show. But the information they be giving to help them run the show is just more incompetence. So bureaucracies and water and incompetence seem to be endemic. There's lots of problems in society. There's healthcare, but water seems to be very endemically incompetent because we don't see it. There aren't enough experts. The experts they are like me. They know some things about some things, but not about other things. People think I'm a great expert, and what I've kind of figured out lately is no, not really. I'm a little expert in my little niche. So how do we solve all of this? And universities and NGOs and all of that are going to need to play a role. But I don't think ideology is the key. The goal is to solve the problems. But how could it be that the universities and the government agencies that fund research from the taxpayers' dollars, how could it be that they allowed all the work of their professors and all of that to end up in the private sector for profit? And that's in the Western world. So we have to ask ourselves, what line of thinking led to that? Whatever that line of thinking was, it's encumbering us in many other ways. Norm.
What role do you see for desalinization of seawater in dense coastal areas where most of the larger cities using an awful lot of water are the end users?
Yeah. Very good question. So if you're from rich countries and you have a level of arrogance, what you're going to think is that technology solves it. So for little places like Singapore and whatnot, they're solving their water problem with desalinization. The costs have gone down. The technologies are marvelous. That's where all the investments have been made. But those are very energy intensive, and the amount of water you produce is very small. So that solution and all the fanfare that comes from it is interfering with clear thinking. It's not a way out. Yeah. But I'm glad you asked that question because it interferes with the thinking. For some cities like Singapore, it's the only way out. Singapore has 5 million people. They're a little island. The water from Malaysia is unreliable by a pipeline. They have to do that, and they lead the way. So technology and advanced thinking has to be the solution. Like these simple drilling machines, how do you make them cheaper? How do you make them better? Has there been any investment by the global community in developing drilling machines for the purpose? None. That one drilling machine I mentioned was funded by a Rotary Club. These other machines have no outside investment at all. That's because, in fact, the world that's out there, the World Bank, the UNESCO, WHO, the Gates Foundation, they're all in their high technology rich world mindset. Like, do they ever walk out in the country and see what's going on? Don't they see that people need low-cost wells? Don't they see that the people themselves have to drill the wells? If your drilling machines are too complicated, then nobody can run the damn machines. Then you have to go to drilling school. And that's an example of technology developed to suit the rich countries. That's in the exact opposite direction of what humanity needs. Interesting.
Somebody more?
There's a question for John, sorry for the English, from the audience, via web, and it's in English. So, is there a need to build more water reservoirs, and is the public willing to pay that cost? Yeah. Is there a need to build more water reservoirs, and is the public willing to pay that cost? And the second one from Eric Marquez is our need to create alternative water sources is increasing day by day. Can we adequately predict long-term effects on the natural balance?
So it's not that we don't have enough water, okay, and we're going to add 2 billion people, but and the book on the end of plenty, so the people who look at how you could produce food, healthy food, with minimal water, and the people like me who look at all the water we have out there, we don't see a water shortage. We in a global perspective, we see a management shortage. So the person who invented modern business management, a guy called Peter Drucker, now deceased, but he established modern business management practices that all the business schools follow. And he has many quotations. And one of them is, you can't manage what you don't measure. Okay, and for me, that means, well, half of my career has gone into developing better equipment for groundwater monitoring. Hardly any, I only know maybe of 1 or 2 places in the world where groundwater is monitored in a way that allows you to do thinking. So the first thing that society and governments need to do is agree to monitor groundwater. When you overpump groundwater and you're draining the continents, you're basically lowering the water table. And a water table is a very simple concept. If you went out the door and drilled a hole, and you're drilling down, and when water starts to flow in, and you go away overnight, and it settles up to a level, that's the water table. Not deep drilling, shallow deep drilling. So it's that shallow level that's easy to monitor that doesn't get monitored. So I mean, as a groundwater scientist, we're operating as if technology didn't exist. We're operating as if knowledge didn't exist. Because society doesn't see groundwater. The government agencies generally have very few people that understand groundwater. And we are operating totally from ignorance. And I think I forgot the first question. I get rambling off here, sorry.
Is there a need to build more water reservoirs?
Oh.
Is the public willing to pay for
Yeah, okay. Is there a need for more water reservoirs, and is the public willing to pay for them? Water reservoirs are not the issue. Water reservoir thinking is part of the problem. Because when droughts come along, they dry up. So reservoirs as we know them, big reservoirs for city and whatnot and so forth. But we need millions of little water reservoirs, just little ponds, little dugouts, little tanks, where we collect the water from the roofs, we collect it when it rains. So the problem is we've got lots of rainfall, and in many cases like India and parts of Mexico, it rains a short period of the time too hard. The water escapes to the oceans and it's gone. So we're not managing water. And India is in a phenomenal case because they have the monsoons, and that's how India used to operate. That's how the farmers used to operate when they had 200 million people. So India is tending towards terrible circumstances because they're not even collecting the water that rains. So I'm glad you asked the question. We need to rethink the idea of a reservoir. A reservoir can be a house. A reservoir can be a farm. We need to rethink what basically water engineering is all about. So one of the problems with shall we say, water engineering, when an expert from a country like Canada goes to some other country is they have no idea how to solve the problems because they're educated in a different paradigm. So what's kind of surprising is that in the wealthy countries like Canada that have a lot of rainfall, we've developed water education. And these professors publish all the books. They are the centers of knowledge. And much of the knowledge they have to give to the world is not the right knowledge. So the revolutions we need in groundwater and groundwater education are phenomenal, and they need to start at the universities. One more question. So the professors, these poor, unfortunate souls who are locked into this crazy system, they have to compete in their careers to publish papers in the normal journals. The normal journals are run and edited by the rest of us. They're run for us. So in fact, in the rest of the world, where in fact the knowledge we need is different, the whole system is set up against it. I mean, I'm welcome to, I'm saying kind of, speaking from my heart here, but if there's people that have other ideas and whatnot, that's fine.
Me comentan que estamos llegando al límite de tiempo, por tanto le cedería la palabra a Jorge Arriaga para la conclusión y por supuesto agradeciendo su participación y presencia. Seguramente ahorita podemos tener un tiempo de interacción para seguir abundando los temas.